Saw 3 could have easily been the end of the series. It killed off its primary antagonist in Jigsaw and wrapped up just about everything that it could. That's not how horror franchises work though, do they? While it's easy to say that the massive $165 million box office of Saw 3 is responsible for the production of Saw 4, the truth is that the movie was greenlit before the third entry ever even hit theaters. How would the story progress after the death of John Kramer? Who would be in the director's chair to follow up the most successful film in the franchise? And what would the original creators have to do with this outing? Well, sit back and prepare for another game as we find out just what happened to Saw 4.
Now perhaps you will succeed where the others have failed.
Saw 4 opens with the audience witnessing an autopsy. It takes place immediately after the events of Saw 3, with Jigsaw himself, John Kramer, being the one that is getting opened up and looked inside. This scene is somehow more graphic than many of the execution set pieces that litter the franchise, and were shockingly passed uncut through the MPAA, without any request to change anything. The idea behind this was to make it stand out from scenes that would appear in shows like CSI that would regularly have an autopsy to discuss the victim. While we see Tobin Bell's face, it was actually a body cast that took 2 weeks to make, and the cuts and overall procedure might look more realistic than most because they had an actual coroner in the room at all times. And like many of Jigsaw's games, we see he's thought even this out as Detective Hoffman pulls a tape out of his body, signaling a new batch of tests to be taken. Before we get into the rest of the movie, let's discuss the old and new guard. Leigh Whannell and James Wan had started a multi-million-dollar series and a yearly October tradition, but were pretty much done by the end of the third film's production. In 2007, the same year that Saw 4 had come out, Wan would be focused much more on 2 other movies, Dead Silence, which he wrote and directed, and Death Sentence, which he was only behind the camera for. Whannell would still write the screenplay for Saw 3, but would then move on from the series to focus heavily on the Insidious franchise, and before that, Dead Silence with his good friend James. One holdover from the group was director Darren Lynn Bousman, who would help write Part 2, and also get his first directing job on that movie. As we discovered in our look at Part 3, he agreed to direct that movie because the group's producer friend had passed away. He had mixed thoughts on taking over the duty a third time for a third sequel, as he was terrified of being the horror sequel guy in Hollywood. The first offer to direct actually went to David Hackle, who would end up declining, but coming back to direct Part 5. After reflection, Bousman changed his tune, and he had a blast on all 3 movies, and it allowed him to get his dream project, Repo the Genetic Opera, to the big screen. After the autopsy scene, Saw 4 jumps immediately to one of its signature traps. There were a couple of different variations, including something that pulled the 2 men that we see upward, or a room that slowly filled with water. Budget and time restrictions changed it to 2 men being slowly pulled towards each other, as well as a deadly trap. Prosthetic thread was used on both men, but while Kevin Rushton was able to see with the thread on, Luis Ferreira actually couldn't speak. The movie, as we see, will jump back and forth between scenes and characters that we saw in the previous installment, and new traps and tests. This was to better utilize the now dead Jigsaw killer, or his voice at least, as actor Tobin Bell had been signed on for both parts 4 and 5. While the first 3 movies form a loose trilogy, the writers brought back elements from all 3 previous films, while starting their own mini-series within the series by adding characters like FBI agent Peter Strahm and Detective Mark Hoffman. The first inkling of this is when the body of Dina Meyer is discovered by police, and a second accomplice is deduced. Something that Part 3 sets up with Carrie's death being against the rules Jigsaw had set up when her key doesn't work. Dina Meyer is brought back, but so is Angus McFadden from Part 3 and Donnie Wahlberg from Part 2. The movie makes it hard to figure out exactly who the accomplice is, and sets up a new set of games with multiple people.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
With neither Wan or Winnell having any interest in writing, they would stay on as producers. They claimed that the movie would be done right as the series was their baby and new writers would need to be brought in. Producers read a script for a movie called The Midnight Man, which would eventually become The Collector, something that has more than a few thematic and tone similarities with the Saw series. Marcus Dunstan and Patrick Melton would be those writers, and in addition to writing 4 consecutive Saw movies, they were able to make both The Collector and The Collection while having a hand in writing other horror flicks like the Wacky Feast series as well as Piranha 3 Double D. When they first took over the job, they thought their script was going to be used as a prequel to the series, which would have made bringing back John Kramer even easier. Ultimately, the producers decided that a prequel wasn't what they wanted and went forward with a direct sequel to Part 3. That, as we would find out, would also take place during the end of Part 3. Also on their minds was a purported Saw Bible that was to be used in crafting all works in the series, but their script was accepted before they were ever even in possession of any Saw Bible, and in fact, they would never see one. Their script was trimmed down for time and budget, though parts of it were eventually used in Part 5. This works in the movie's favor as Part 4 fits in with the rest of the series at a clean 92 minutes. They leaned heavily on Bousman, who had directed the 2 previous films, and ended up pitching their own trilogy with the previously mentioned Hoffman and Strom. Working with Bousman was essential, even if he would bow out of directing future films, until coming back for Spiral starring Chris Rock. The movie cuts back and forth between the past and the present, while giving us a little history on detectives Hoffman and Rigg, who end up getting kidnapped and put in the game, Hoffman being a prisoner, and Rigg being the one that has to run through the gauntlet of traps and the trapped. To keep the series consistent, the writers made Rigg one of the main characters, as he played a minor role in the previous 2 films. While Hoffman is trapped for the majority of the runtime, at least in the past, Rigg gets to run through various rooms deciding the fates of people. Some of them set into their own traps that he tries to save, like a trafficker that is in danger of being scalped, or the apartment manager that he is instructed to put into the trap and to decide his own fate. Later, Rigg is tasked with confronting a woman who had already won her designated trap, but leaves her to be rescued. The traps in this movie run the gamut from being particularly grisly, like the hotel manager having to put his own eyes out or be dismembered, to the more mundane of the couple trapped together with spikes that must be removed. The special effects team was split between practical and CG special effects, with a whopping 36 team members working on it. These are complemented by production designer David Hackle, who, as we discussed, would go on to direct the next film. Rigg eventually finds both Hoffman and Donnie Wahlberg's Eric in their respective traps, while Strom finds out about Jill Tuck, Jigsaw's wife, and a bit about the past of John Kramer, which is another easy way to work in Tobin Bell. All signs lead to their lawyer being the secret apprentice, and the on-screen evidence of both the lawyer being the surviving victim in the first trap and us seeing him hold Hoffman and Matthews hostage are pretty staggering. The movie ends with us seeing all these traps and characters took place during the same time frame as the previous film. It wraps up every loose end from the movie while also setting up the new series with Strom and Hoffman, and revealing that Hoffman was the other apprentice. Saw 4 was filmed over 32 days in Toronto on a budget of just $10 million. It was then shipped to theaters under the codename Angelfish and released on October 26, 2007, in what had become the standard release timeframe for the series. It would make almost $140 million, which is still the 3rd highest in the series, behind parts 3 and 2. Critically, it holds an 18% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the 3rd lowest of the films, and has a solid B cinema score from viewing audiences. The series would not slow down, and we'd be tasked with yet another yearly release in 2008. And that is what happened to Saw 4.
Cut!
Cutting there.
That is a picture up on Lyric Bent.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo remains an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.